how Trump's administration 2.0 will affect offshoring worldwide. Well, today we discuss. Today we are going to do some, food for thought on how the new administration of Donald Trump will affect offshore affairs regarding freedom of movement worldwide and human movement, and also, we're going to address a little bit on how it can affect trade overall. And by the way, this is not a video bashing or bad-mouthing Donald Trump, anything like that. He is taking measures on his administration that he got voted, and that was a mandate. According, that's the buzzword in US politics. Cool on that. So if you're watching this from the States, if you're a Trump supporter, good for you. This is not gonna be, a video bashing him. And if you are a Trump's detractor, you're gonna be a little bit disappointed. But at the end of the day, regardless, let's say if you are watching this from the States and you either love him or hate him, there are gonna be some countermeasures. Not everything is perfect. I think he is gonna fulfill his particular agenda regarding the offshore affairs. However, there are gonna be significant impacts to the average US citizen. So let's start discussing how it will affect human movement. Well, many people, especially if you're watching this from the States or a very developed nation, you might think that the world is very multicultural, and I think it is the case. However, you think that movement, every country is very easy to migrate, or just many times just visiting such country is easy, and that is not the case, because you see news that people arriving from, poor countries to your particular country, let's say the US, let's say the UK, let's say the European Union. Well, European Union is another thing on that regard, whatever might be the case. And what happens is that the human movement has a lot of restrictions worldwide regarding getting tourist visas and getting the legal procedures in order to migrate to other countries, especially a developed country, is very, very difficult legally. Meanwhile, most people, the people who are motivated in order to migrate illegally to another country usually are the lower middle class of, people from poor countries. Usually the high middle class of undeveloped nations, usually they have opportunities either on their home country, or they migrate to, let's say, slightly more developed nation that has a more reasonable migration policy. So now let's discuss the new status quo regarding migration worldwide to the US. I'm not talking just about the US this time. And what happens is, just visiting the United States is difficult unless you come from a country on the visa exception program, mostly the European Union nations, the UK, Canada, Australia, and a handful of others, and that's it. And sometimes even the people from those countries have an issue entering to the United States. For instance, I've heard several cases of people from Portugal, from Spain, so let's say not the most developed nations within the European Union, and other countries on similar cases. So on that regard, that is not necessarily the best status quo. Now, if your particular country, or you're a passport holder of another, let's say, less developed nation, let's say Mexico, let's say Argentina, places like that. So let's say second-tier countries. What happens? Even then, first you need to get a tourist visa, the B1, B2. That is very complicated. to actually get. So that is not a good news in that regard. It's a very draconian process. It takes a lot of time, costs quite some money, so requires documentation, things like that. I'm not saying that's good or bad, just saying it is what it is. And many times, for several reasons, they got rejected. And this is from people that are high middle class on their countries. I'm talking about the top 20, top 30% regarding income on such countries. So it's quote unquote, let's say, more desirable visitors on your country that usually do it in order to apply, in order to take vacations or maybe a short educational course, something like that. Still, is kind of a draconian process. The people that you see, let's use, the cliches of the US migration, like the gardeners that you see from Central America in the US, they are never gonna get a B1, B2 visa. That is complicated. This is just the tourist visa, by the way. It's not the quote-unquote green card. And they don't have actually a legal migration path in order to get to the US. Now, in other countries is almost as difficult, the UK, that many people will say, well, the UK has a bunch of migrants. Just entering the UK, this is just entering the UK as a visitor is very complicated. It's probably, for me, the most difficult tourist visa to get. And it's a draconian process and doesn't have any sense. But anyways, and you have countries like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, what Andrew Henderson calls the Kuna countries. It's funny. So these Kuna countries, just for the sake of the conversation, just getting the tourist visa is difficult. So. I mean, still you can get it, but still, it's a draconian process. So, because many people, I'm saying this because many people think that entering to the US or a country like that is actually very, very difficult. And sometimes it happens that becomes more difficult for the citizens of these countries, the US, the UK, the quote-unquote Kuna countries. It's more difficult for them, and they get, let's say, a worse treatment on that regard when they visit another country. Let's say, for instance, Brazil. I heard this a lot from Brazilian people that usually they have a reciprocity policy. I mean, I know here that's what happens, a reciprocity policy. Also, a country like Colombia, I'm hearing rumors that might happen to US citizens. I don't know if it's going to happen. I'm just, for now, it's just a rumor. I'm going to make a video right when that thing happens, if it happens. So the first prediction is that regarding Trump and the Trump administration and offshoring affairs is that by the end of the Trump 2.0 administration, the US will have less countries to with visa-free access. So I'm not saying it's going to be a draconian thing, but I think the US is going to lose, the US citizens are going to lose like 2 or 3 countries that right now they can enter visa-free, and they're going to lose such privilege. Other thing that I think we're going to have after the Trump 2.0 administration is that a handful of countries are going to apply even more draconian and xenophobic policies on their own systems. For instance, I'm going to say this with Canada. Entering Canada is very, very hard. I know that if you're watching this from Canada, you think, the gates are wide open. And by the way, this is a fairly logical thing that Canada only has a border with the US. So basically, most people that enter Canada, they do it legally because they either got a tourist visa or a student visa, or they have visa exemption programs to developed countries. So it's more difficult actually to enter to Canada compared to the US. Many people don't see it like this, but actually de facto on the legal procedure is like that. And of course, there was a loophole with refugees and things like that, but I'm not going to get into that. So there you have it. So I think Canada is going to get, it's a terrible migration policy. Regardless if you like it or not, it's terrible. And I think it's going to get worse. And also that will create some backlash to Canadian citizens as well. Other thing that might happen is these different programs that are relatively easy are going to become more difficult for US citizens and a handful of other nationalities. For instance, in Europe, we're seeing the decline of the golden visa options that you had on several countries. So in the past half a decade, some of these programs have been closed. And in Europe, this is mostly in Europe, but something that you may see these programs closing and closing and closing. Other issue that's happening worldwide is the prices on the CBI's citizenship by investment programs are rising their prices as well, especially on the Caribbean, and those prices have gone up on the past half a decade. And more demand, of course, that happens, and also they are limiting the issuance on such CBI programs and the approval rates. Something that might happen is, this is for the average US citizen, is that when they travel, let's say, to these more exotic places, like, in Africa or Southeast Asia, or whatever might be the case, very remote places, this is not a quantitative, but more of a qualitative consequence, negative consequence, is that they're going to get a worse treatment when they present their US passport, because the stigma that it will generate from the policies of Donald Trump. For instance, he cut the USAA. That, of course, there are a bunch of, according to the media and the reports from the White House, a bunch of corruptions on these on the programs funded by the USAA. I'm not going to discuss that, and if it's good or bad. Well, I always, let's say, I'm pro efficient spending, and I think it wasn't the case with the USAA. But regardless of whatever you might think, watching the news and the info getting from the White House or Twitter or whatever may be the case, some of these programs indeed are helpful for a lot of communities regarding, medical aid, food programs, also relief for disaster funding. That, okay, if you're watching this from the state, you say, well, I don't care, they are not my people, whatever may be the case, but actually it's a very good humanitarian thing that helps a bunch of very poor countries. And okay, maybe you think this selfishly, I don't want to use my taxes in order to pay for that. Okay, that's your opinion. But this is something that is not, this is not just a handheld. This thing generates soft power, and that reduces, on the near future, will reduce spending on through the State Department, the Department of Defense, whatever may be the case. So you are creating allies, not only on the diplomatic level, but also the people that are being served, let's say a small town in Africa or a community in Asia, whatever may be the case, that people will always remember the United States helped them, and this is a good thing because that translates into soft power to every American citizen in the world. Because having, and this is something that is trending down, but it used to be the case that having an American passport was the best passport in the world. That's not the case right now. Still a good passport, not as great, and the tendency is going down, 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 slowly but steady. And the consequence, if you're an American, you may say, well, I don't care, but actually over 10 million Americans live outside of the US, so they are your fellow countrymen. And another, I don't have the number right now, but I'm going to just take a shot. Let's say 20 million Americans travel abroad outside of the US every year. So you have mass of 30 million Americans outside of the US every single year. Let's just use this arbitrary number. But it's almost 10% of the American population. And, this thing can compound for the better or the worse. And that will generate, let's say, God forbid, a situation where an American gets an issue and outside, everywhere, when you're traveling, when you're living in another country, an issue might present itself for the better or worse. Accident, natural disaster, some social unrest at any given country, and that might affect one of your fellow American citizens. And if the US has a great soft power, this is soft power, just soft power, this is something that can benefit every American citizen abroad or can hinder their position in the world at any given situation.
Thank you for watching Continental Insider. Please like, share, and subscribe. Follow us on social media. And if you want to work with us, continentalinsider.com. Thanks again, and have a nice day.